Still.
Timeless.
People ask why. Why those drums? My response is why not?
Yeah.
Right. Why not?
I ask why not. There's a comedian, Brian Regan.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Very clean comedian. He also doesn't do a lot of politically charged things.
Sure.
And he did a bit where he talks about, the most political thing they do is they do impersonations of the Kennedys. And it's like imagine them at the Thanksgiving dinner table, and John F. Kennedy is like, ask not who you could pass the mashed potatoes to, but who could pass the mashed potatoes to you, And then I had that backwards, and then Robert F. Kennedy is, some look at cream corn and ask why. I look at cream corn and ask why not. That was good.
He's a good one. My favorite one is his like Little League, when he's talking about playing for Little League. That's an older one, but yeah, I like Brian Regan.
Then he goes Ted Kennedy. He's like, these are good roles. Something stupid. Yeah, the Little League bit he did is really good. All right.
I'll have grape.
Or cherry. They're both favorite. Grape's a little more favorite than cherry. All right, we got to stop this or else he gets copyright.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, we better stop that. Yeah. You go listen to him. Yeah.
Yeah, it was, oh gosh, too funny. All right, so we've done a lot of great conversations.
Quality content.
Yeah, quality content that you, the viewer, or listener, have heard. And we've done like a couple different things, right? And we
in a lot of locations.
In a lot of locations. We've been in the same location for three episodes.
Yeah, three episodes.
That's pretty cool. Now we've got a sweet boombox here, though.
We'll see where we end up next
with a cassette tape player.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite things that we get to do is when we kind of get into the more philosophical, apologetic-esque type conversations.
Right.
And that's one of them that we're going to do today is we're going to discuss something known as the moral argument or the argument from morality. Mm-hmm. And really what this is an argument for the existence of God.
Right.
Now, I want to preface this. We will be kind of using this idea of the argument of morality for the existence of the God of the Bible.
Right.
That is going to be our leaning. But it is, It is, in a philosophical sense, a more generic argument for the existence of a God or for theism.
Right, for theism.
In general. Right?
For sure.
Which is really, and here's the thing, I think it's, sometimes we struggle if we only look at Christianity from our Christian lens and growing up in Christianity, if that's who you were.
Right.
Sometimes I think it's hard for us to understand that there is a rational, logical, step-by-step argument that gets you from there is a God to this is the God.
100%. Right. I think then that is that. I mean, I love the moral argument because I was telling you a little earlier that this is one of the things that actually, when I came around back into faith, that kind of helped me into that. And, here's the thing about the moral argument. It's great. It's great for a lot of reasons. In fact, I think it's really amazing especially for the Christian faith, but for theism in general, it answers a lot of questions. Here's the problem I think that a lot of people face with theism to get to an existence of God. Once you reach the existence of God, from a philosophical standpoint, you then have to ask, okay, well, like you said, which God?
Which God?
And then you'd have to take it. So the moral argument can, if you allow it, take you from no God, no existence, to existence, to the existence of the one and only God.
But that's kind of the gotcha question that the atheist will bring up, or the non-believer will bring up, is that, well, which God? Almost as if to say that because there are several to choose from,
right,
is in itself an argument for why there are none.
Right.
And that's the thing, is you have to ignore that part to start.
Right.
You have to start with is there a creator?
Right.
And then you can't say, but because we haven't been able to agree, and here's the thing, the majority of the world has kind of come into an agreement.
Right.
We'll get into that a little bit, but because we don't agree on which one it could be.
Right.
And it's funny, they always bring up like dead gods too, like the pantheons of the Greek and the Roman that nobody believes in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there is no evidence for them.
Right. 100%. Right.
Other than the fact that people worshipped them at some point.
Right.
Or adhere to some religious aspect around them. They'll always like pull these up and like, well, there's all these gods to choose from. Checkmate. If there's too many gods to choose from, then there must be no
Well,
God.
your definition of God is wrong.
That's
You know what I mean? Like
exactly it,
and that was my thing is once I came back into the faith and started believing, not in Christian, but just in God in general, I said, all right, well, there's who, which one? Well, by definition, God is the all powerful being, right? Well, there can only be one, right? It's what is that? There can only be one. What is that?
Highlander.
There can only be there can only be one, right? So there can only be one God. Okay, so that takes out all of those polytheistic faiths that have multiple gods. So monotheistic faiths, there's only three. There's Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, right? And I gave them in reverse order, but and they all kind of have the same beginning.
Well, Christianity and Judaism arguably have the same God.
Right. Exactly right. And so I say all that to say that, like, if you just use logic, you can make it to Christianity very easy.
Yeah.
That's how I did. And you can easily make it of the three monotheistic faiths, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, like you said. That was what I did. I said, hey, this God in Judaism, it's the oldest God, right? It's the first, because Islam comes around much later, and Christianity comes in later. So arguably, but you read the Old Testament or the Torah, and you're like, hey, this is good. And then I'm gonna read the next chapter. Hey, this is good. And I'm gonna read the next book, which is, and eventually I got to a point that I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound like the last book I just read. Like that's a different author.
Right.
So logically you can get there. And what's really interesting and what I love about the moral argument is it's teaching you a tool that you can do not just with morality, but you could do with a lot of things as far as proving the existence of God.
Yeah. And I think this is the mistake too that the naysayer will say. They'll say, well, even if I grant you the moral argument, you can't prove to me that a specific God is the right God. And that is just laziness.
Well, you just do your research 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Do your research. So let's go into the moral argument or the argument for morality. This is based on a moral normativity or moral order.
Right.
Arguments from moral normativity observe some aspect of morality and argue that God is the best or only explanation for this, concluding that God must exist.
Right.
Right. So, like, you'll hear somebody say, I'm a good person.
Right.
I'm a good person. I pay my taxes.
Right.
As we were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, I pay my taxes.
But the moral argument is the one that goes deeper than that, right?
Right.
So if you say that you're a good person, the question becomes, where do you derive your definition of what goodness is?
We all have a code of ethics, whether we believe in God or not. Everybody has a code of ethics.
Right.
The question that the moral argument is posing is, where did that ethic come from?
It's also suggesting that without a author of morality,
100%,
then morality cannot exist.
100%.
So if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist.
Right.
Because objective moral values and duties do exist, we would say that that's obvious.
Right.
Then therefore God must exist.
Right.
Right. So this is the logic of the moral argument.
Right.
C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity said, conscience reveals to us a moral law whose source cannot be found in the natural world, thus pointing to a supernatural lawgiver.
Right.
And what I love about this is when he talks about the natural world, there's kind of this misnomer that everything has to be proven by quote unquote science.
Right.
By natural science.
Right.
But the answer to why is not in science.
No.
In natural science, the answer to like what or how can be found in many cases in natural science.
Right.
But there's more to the human existence than natural science.
100%.
So again, there is a conscious that we have in our mind, in our, in our being that testifies to this idea of an existing moral code.
Right. Like, for example, like murder. Most people, sane people, your average everyday person, if you just walked up to someone on the street and said, hey, is murder okay? Is murder a good thing? I'd say vast majority of people would be like, no, murdering is not a good thing.
Well, we got a lot of people who think themselves too big for their britches, or a little bit too smart, who will then say, "Well, it depends."
Of course, they'll preface it, and if they preface it, by all means, let them go. The question you're going to get to though is eventually, okay, so like let's tease that out just for a second. So let's just say, okay, is murder? I asked that question, is murder, and you come back and you say, well, it depends on what you're saying. Okay, so let me make it more specific, because that's what you're asking for, is specific. Is it wrong or right, in your opinion? This is what I would say. Is it wrong or right, in your opinion, I'm going to get real graphic, to shoot an innocent child and kill them? A child that has, an innocent child, they're standing on the street, and to walk up to that child and to shoot that child. Is that okay? How would you respond to that? And be the devil's advocate here.
Sure. Do I have any foreknowledge that said child will grow up to be, say, Hitler?
No.
Okay. Because I think, again, well, and here's what I'm trying to do as the naysayer.
Right.
Is I'm trying to make it subjective as opposed to objective.
Right.
Is that child a suicide bomber?
No. Well, see, yeah. Well, that's good. That's a better question. Yeah.
I'm missing the context that you're providing of it's an innocent.
It's an innocent child, right?
It's an innocent child.
It's an innocent child. And if someone were to go that route, I'd be like, well, you've actually solved this, because clearly you believe in the ability to see the future. So you believe in supernatural things. So God does exist. Here we go.
Well, as long as we're doing hypotheticals.
No, but no, and that's exactly why, like I said, innocent. The key word here is innocent. So this is an innocent person.
But see, we already missed that when you said murder. Right. A lot of people miss this too, is that murder is the killing of the innocent.
Innocent, right, 100%.
Like the Ten Commandments is thou shalt not murder, not thou shalt not kill.
Kill, 100%, exactly.
A lot of people miss that doesn't account for or even capital punishment.
And I was going to say, even if you want to take it even to the step of the law, murder is planned. It's
premeditated.
Manslaughter is, whoops, I accidentally killed this person. Murder is intentional.
So I am choosing to actively end this person's life. That's what murder means.
Right. And so there's no extraneous or extenuating circumstances. So, but anyway, if you tease this all out and you go through all of the rigmarole of the high and mighty, thinker that is putting these hypotheticals, like, do I know they're going to be, Hitler? I didn't know you had a time machine, or the ability to, clairvoyance.
Let me give you an answer I've actually heard on this one here. Is like, because I know that it would be detrimental to me to kill that child, because now I would be going to prison. So logically, it would be, I can stop short of saying it's wrong,
right?
But I can say that based on my predictive ability of what will happen next, I know that it will be bad, in a sense that somebody will grieve that child. Because while I may have no moral or attachment to said kid,
sure,
somebody does,
right?
So first, I know it will grieve somebody,
right,
and second, I know that I will pay a compensation for this, which will be life in prison,
right,
and potentially the death penalty, out of a sense of self-preservation and out of a sense of wanting to be accepted in a larger societal group,
right?
Because the societal norm is that killing is wrong,
right?
I know that I shouldn't do that because of the impeding, like what will happen following that.
Well, I think if someone goes that route with that argument, well, they just knocked into two different. Okay, so like when you were saying like, okay, so you know that it's going to make the family feel bad, and so why does that matter?
Oh, that's a really good question. It matters, and this is what the atheist or the non-moral absolutist will say, or the subjective morality person will say.
Right.
It doesn't matter in that their grief has some form of value.
Right.
It matters in a sense that it will make it harder for me to navigate around them.
Right. So why does that matter?
It matters because I am the singular most important in my world. And my ease of navigating through this world is dependent upon how I behave and how people respond to my behavior.
Right. So that's what I was kind of getting at, was I figured that's what someone would probably say in that situation is, so now we're talking like, now we're on to a quote unquote different sin, right? So we moved off from murder, and now we're on to I'm the only single thing that matters. All right. So we've gotten to like Nietzsche. You know what I mean? Like this is do what
Right.
you want philosophy.
Well, the reason I don't do what I want is because it preserves me by not doing what I want.
Right.
Because, so like there's no
Self-preservation is important.
self-preservation is the key there. So I tell you what, let's back up a touch.
Yeah.
As this was a great exercise, but let's define morality.
I think that's exactly right. Sure.
So Oxford says morality is principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So, so if that's true, so if morality is basically when we say what is moral is what is right and what is wrong, and it's the determination
Right.
of those two things.
Right.
So the questions we have is where does your sense of right and wrong come from?
That's where I was gonna go with the conversation was if they bring it down to they're the single most important thing, how do you define good and evil?
Well, the thing is you don't.
Right.
You have to not. If you're being honest, you have to say that there is no objective right or wrong.
Right.
There's only what is beneficial and what is not.
Right.
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 So good becomes that which is beneficial for me or for society.
Right.
And even then you have to see why does society matter?
Right. It's all subjective at that point.
So you have to then make everything about the flourishing of society.
Right.
Now, what's funny about that is science proves and studies prove
Right.
that where there are religious people, society flourishes.
Sure.
So therefore,
Right. 100%.
therefore, okay. And so then, what do we line up our sense of right and wrong with to prove that as true or false? So again,
Right.
what is our litmus for this? What is our basis for this? What is our foundation for saying one thing is right to do and one thing is wrong to do?
Right.
And I think what we find is for those who have a subjective sense of morality,
Right.
it always comes back to how it makes them feel or how it impacts their life.
Right.
Even when they're saying it will impact you negatively.
Right.
The reason why that matters is because you being impacted negatively makes me feel bad.
That's where if someone goes to the idea of like subjective morality, which is like it's all about this is the ultimate of both political spectrums is like just do what you want, right? That's both libertarian kind of idea and I won't say libertarian because but like that's that idea. Like those, if you go too far one way, it's you do whatever you want. You go too far the other way, it's you do eventually come all the way back to a circle. And
I would say that liberal is do whatever you want. I'd say libertarian is have the freedom to choose what you want with the consequence for what you've chosen.
Sure.
But that's a different
podcast for a different time.
Different
but either way, if you go to that mindset of like you can just do whatever you want, I think if someone goes subjective, then you completely have to talk about so like if someone said it's about me and it'll make me feel, so let me ask you, is it okay if I come into your house in the middle of the night, kill you and your entire family? Kill them, murder them?
No.
No, why?
Well, because it would end the flourishing of my family.
Right, but it would increase the flourishing of my family. So why is my family more important than your family?
Well, that would depend on the settings, right?
Right.
Like in America, that technically wouldn't, especially if you were caught.
Right. Sure.
Right. But you make a great point. Like from a old school conquest.
Sure.
Like it was colonialism was great because it increased the flourishing of those doing the colonialism.
I mean, why is the war in Ukraine bad? I mean, that's what I would say to someone. Like, why is that? Why are we appalled by that?
What's funny is as you say that, and this has been something I've been seeing is people talking about that is like, well, it's bad because Russia's bad.
Right.
But what's been interesting is you have seen like a split based on party lines in a lot of places of like how much we should be supporting.
For sure. Right.
And what's funny is I've been seeing kind of those on the right who are saying we're over supporting the Ukraine.
Sure.
Pointing out to those on the left who are saying we're under supporting Ukraine. What do you know about the Ukraine's immigration laws?
Oh yeah, for sure.
What do you?
Yeah, right.
Like there are a lot of things that Ukraine does that the left would say was wrong if it was applied to the United States.
Right.
But they feel that we need to protect the Ukraine. And here's the thing. I don't want to get into whether or not we should protect.
That's another podcast for another time.
Another podcast for another time. But I think what it highlights here is that if morality is subjective,
100%,
what is right is right, and what is right isn't always right, and what is wrong isn't always wrong.
Right.
How do we determine that?
Who gets to be right?
Who gets to be right?
100%.
How do we decide?
Why is it okay for you to murder my family, but not okay for me to murder your family? Right. You know what I mean? And that, I know those are extremes, right? But I think that's sometimes with morality has to be sometimes dealt with in extremes, because that's where morality begins to break down. Right. Like, and so not morality, but like the moral argument, that's where the moral argument starts to flourish, because as you start breaking it down, suddenly it becomes clear that subjectivity isn't easy.
Right. Now, the subjective moralist will say, society has to determine as a group what is right or wrong. And so we get our source of authority on morality from a societal decision, which is what results in laws, things like that. Now, the problem with that is we know that what is always lawful is not always right.
Right.
I think a great case of this historically in America is slavery.
100%.
Slavery is wrong.
For sure.
Okay. But it was legally accepted.
Right.
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 And so this is where you start running into an issue with a societal, because now you have morality by democracy, meaning the majority determines and determines what is right and what is wrong, as opposed to there is a set standard for what is right and wrong, and you have to trust the majority to care about the minority.
And morality is contingent, meaning it depends upon context, time, location. Because I know a lot of people who don't subscribe to an idea of God, or the Christian God.
Sure.
They will say, slavery is bad. It wasn't bad. So because the question I would ask is, why is slavery bad? Like, why was it bad back then? And because they thought it was good back then. But why is it bad now? Why is suddenly now it bad, but back then it wasn't? You know what I'm saying? Like, so when you begin to call it the contingency of time, right? Because this is the argument, and this is the argument for like the LGBTQ community and things like that. Well, it was wrong back then, but it's not wrong anymore.
Right. And see, that's the thing is, so like if we go back to slavery example, human worth has to exist in order for us to say slavery is wrong.
Right.
Okay. The question and the moral argument says, what grants human worth?
Right.
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 If there is no authority behind that, if there is no banner that's upheld behind that, if it wasn't put there in place by something, then it's only based on our feeling. Right. Which changes.
So that means ethics and morality are not timeless. Right. So at some point in time, murder is completely fine. And I don't mean killing. I don't mean self-defense. I'm talking about murder. Yeah.
Like in the Aztec world.
100%.
Where human sacrifice of innocent children was acceptable.
Yeah.
And praised.
Right.
And glorified.
Right.
Yeah. So I think as Christians, we have to ask ourselves then, what do we see as our source or authority for morality?
For sure.
The answer is pretty obvious. It's God. Psalm 111 verse 10 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Mm-hmm. All those who follow his commandments have a good understanding. His praise endures forever." Mm-hmm. So I think that's really interesting. Those who follow his commandments have good understanding.
Yes.
So 1 Peter 1:17 says, "If you address as Father the one who impartially judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your stay on earth, knowing that you were not redeemed with perishable things like silver or gold from your futile way of life inherited from your forefathers, but with precious blood as of a lamb unblemished and spotless, the blood of Christ."
Right.
Something I like there. The Father is one who impartially judges according to each one's work.
Right.
But for him to judge, he has to have a standard.
Right.
And that standard is his.
Right.
Right.
Which is why fear becomes important. Fear, and I think we need to be careful here. Yes, we fear God in the aspect of like, we understand the magnitude of his power, and we understand. I want to be careful because I don't want to screw this up, but I don't fear God in the aspect of I'm afraid of him.
Right.
Because I know he's a loving, amazing, awesome God. I fear God in the aspect of I respect him, and I know that he has the ability and the power to.
Yeah, I fear being on I fear being on the wrong side of him.
Right.
You know, like
Right.
this, a phrase that gets thrown around all the time in modern society right now is being on the wrong side of history.
Right.
I would much rather be on the wrong side of history, which will change with time.
Right.
Than being on the wrong side of God, who is timeless and never changes.
100%. Right. And that's where the morality argument for God begins to really take shape. You just said it. It's timeless.
It's timeless. Acts 5:29 says, "But Peter the apostle answered, we must obey God rather than man."
Right.
Romans 8:6-8 says, "For the mindset on the flesh is death, but the mindset on the spirit is life and peace, because the mindset on the flesh is hostile toward God, for it does not subject itself to the law of God, for it is not even able to do so. And those who are in the flesh cannot please God."
Right.
Galatians 5:16-24, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. For the desire of the flesh is against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. For these are in opposition to one another, in order to keep you from doing whatever you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are sexual immorality, impurity, indecent behavior, idolatry, witchcraft, hostilities, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these, not limited to, of which I forewarn you, just as I have forewarned you that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. Now those who belong to Christ Jesus crucified the flesh with its passions and desires." Now we've done a dive into the fruits of the Spirit before. We talked about walking in the Spirit,
Right?
And Tommy and I did a breakdown of Galatians. But I think what we're seeing here is Paul is showing us here the juxtaposition of this is what goodness looks like. This is what evil looks like.
Right.
Those who are in God do what is good, and those who are not do what is
right. The moral code of God is different than the moral code of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I love here that what Paul really brings out in this too, and we see it in Romans, we see it in Galatians. What Paul really brings out here is that the only way for us to truly walk in morality is to walk in the Spirit.
100%.
If we are not in tune with God, then we will not understand the why behind what he does.
Right.
Or the why behind what he says is right and wrong.
Right.
But when we walk in the flesh, we are constantly guided only by our desires.
Right.
So good becomes whatever makes me feel good.
Right.
You know.
Right. The subjectivity of the like, let's just use the world today, like the subjectivity of good and evil, right? You could put any hot topic issue, LGBTQ, abortion, whatever, put them all on there, put whatever, immigration, all of it. Okay. Slavery. I mean, because there's still slavery in the world. I don't know people know that, but there still is.
It's still a huge, huge issue.
The funny thing is it was not good because it was never good in God's eyes.
Right.
That's the Christian's argument. And there is no time contingency. There is nothing in there because God, and this is what's funny. And this is what's, as a preacher, a lot of fun to do. It's kind of a jerk move. So I'll admit it, but it's kind of cool to be able to say on Sunday, when you say something that is a little controversial from the Bible, I didn't write this.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like that's the part of morality that Christians, I think, struggle with though, is they want to write it.
Yep. Now it's interesting though, because you used an example that the non-believer will throw back at you.
Sure.
Because you said slavery is wrong, and you've said it a couple times in this recording already.
Right.
Slavery was wrong, is wrong, and will always be wrong because God said so.
Right.
Okay. God permitted slavery in the Old Testament.
Right. He didn't endorse it though. He never condoned it. He never says, this is great. Enslave my people, enslave other people. He taught slaves how to live, and he taught masters how to be better, but he never condoned. Nowhere in the Bible does it ever say slavery is accepted.
Well, we also see in the New Testament where Paul writes, is it Philemon?
Yeah, Philemon's the one who's escaped to return.
And he tells his master to welcome him back as a brother. One of the things that's interesting about this is, with Philemon, it was a Roman slave.
Right.
Right. One of the things that we see about the slavery that was permitted in the Old Testament
Right.
is that there wouldn't have even been a question. Did you know, like in the Old Testament, a runaway slave had his freedom?
Right. Oh, for sure.
Like, also, a slave was freed every 7 years.
Right.
What we understand too, like that term and what that title was, what it was for the people of Israel in the Old Testament is different than what we think of in a modern sense when we talk about slavery.
For sure.
Because in our sense, we talk about slavery as people being taken against their will.
Right.
Now, did that happen?
Right.
It did on occasion,
Sure.
but typically through conquest, or you were in battle. So you took.
Well, the slavery that the Israelites experienced in Egypt is a lot like the slavery probably in America. It was forced labor. It was, brutal.
Yeah.
The slavery that the Israelites faced in Babylon, different.
Yeah.
Okay. Because in Babylon, they were enslaved. I mean, they were taken captive and they were taken, but, they were allowed to marry. They were. It was not this. You know what I mean?
It's not the same.
It's not the same. And even slavery in Europe, not the same as slavery in America in the same time.
Right.
You know what I mean?
So it was different.
Right.
And it was a gradual step towards ultimately the ending of slavery.
Right.
Right. So different does not mean that it was good.
Right. No.
God never looked at slavery as being a good thing.
Yeah.
But he did see it as being something that was going to occur.
Right. And that's why he tells in Philemon, he even says, or maybe it's not in Philemon. It has to be in Philemon. He tells the slave owner, like, I mean, there's things like you're not allowed to beat slaves. You're not allowed to stop. I mean, like, you're not
right.
Like God is very clear on but this goes, let's take the morale. Why, right? Why is slavery? Why would God say slavery is wrong? Why didn't God? So you could say, oh, well, God condoned silence is violence, right? Like he didn't say it, but in not saying it, he said it. Well, let's talk about why God would say it's wrong, because he affirms the humanity and the sanctity of every single person,
right.
And that's at the core. I mean, that's why Paul says there's neither slave nor like we're breaking down barriers with Jesus,
because we're all image bearers at this point.
Right.
So we've gone too far into that. The concept of slavery in the Bible, I think that's a longer podcast.
That's another podcast for another time, right?
But the point of this, the point that we're getting at is that God did have a moral.
He's always had a moral code.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So
that's why on this topic of slavery, that's why Christians championed that.
Right.
There was a lot of Christians who didn't, but it was a Christian movement to say, like, this is not right.
But the abolitionists were Christians.
Right. And you'll see that time and time again when movers and shakers of things that are happening were tended to be religious people.
Yeah.
And it was motivated by scripture. It wasn't motivated by personal desire. It was remote.
Right.
We read this in scripture, and that's something's not adding up here.
Right.
And that's what separates the Christian from the world, is the world says, something's not adding up here because I don't feel good.
Right. And this is really the problem that ends up coming. Like, I think the atheist or the non-theist or the non-believer will say, I can get to the conclusion that slavery is wrong without God.
Right.
But our question is how?
Right. How? Show us, please.
Right. And it comes back to there's always a step in there that's missing. So you say, well, the value of the human experience. Well, who puts value on the human experience?
Right. If you just keep asking why,
right,
you get to a point where you're like, I don't know.
Right. And you say, well, if it was good for me, then if it's good for me to be treated this way, then it should be good for somebody else to be treated this way. And you say, oh, so the golden rule.
Right. Exactly right. Yeah.
That, which is a principle of God.
Which is a principle of God, right. Which is where we got it from.
Which is where you got that from.
Right.
It's like, well, I can feel that without God. It's like, maybe you can.
In certain situations.
And maybe you have, but not everybody will.
Right. Treat everybody like you want to be treated.
If you said example with the Aztecs before, they thought it was perfectly fine to do what they were doing.
Right. Right.
So like humanity left unchecked without God or a moral code that God has set for them.
Right.
Always leads to degradation.
I mean, just look at the Nazis. Like, I would venture.
We talk about the Nazis.
I know we love to talk about the Nazis, and we sometimes give the Nazis a little break. I'm going to give the Nazis a break right for a second. I would venture to. I know, just bear with me. I would venture to say that most of the people who participated in the regular Nazi regime, just your run of the mill people, were quote unquote good people.
They certainly saw themselves as such,
right? So I would argue that only high up. So this gets to this idea of societal norm, right and wrong.
right?
They're the only ones who held those deep-rooted beliefs of, who was it? Was it Peterson? I think it was. Is that the guy that everybody's controversial?
Yeah.
That guy, yeah. He was talking about how the Nazis' goal was not to eradicate a population. It was to create as much chaos as they possibly could,
Right.
in the shortest amount of time.
Right.
Because he used the Jews as an example, and he said, and I think he's kind of onto something. He said, everyone knows that the quickest way to win a war is by having the most stuff, like the most bombs, the most tanks. So slave labor is the route,
Yes.
not slave extinction, which is what they were doing, was killing Jews, mass killing, just massively. He said, you're killing your labor force. That doesn't make sense unless your goal wasn't to win the war. It was to create just sheer chaos. Right. And so I use that as an example to say, from the moral argument, if you say, well, society can determine, well, society can be easily swayed.
Society makes mistakes all the
I would
time.
guarantee most of the Nazis who participated in the war were like, oh man, how could we ever have done that?
Yeah.
Well, because we believed.
And they also didn't look too hard at what they were doing.
No, 100%.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's the catch here, is because we can say the same thing. You can say the same thing about, there's people who have done terrible things in the name of God.
Right.
But
for sure.
But we have to look at that objectively and say, okay, did they do it on God's behalf, or did they use the name of God as a rallying point to get people behind their cause?
It's the Crusades.
Right. So the people who were doing that,
Right.
like people who followed them because they thought that God was involved in it, weren't looking hard enough at the scripture.
100%.
Nor were the people who were proclaiming those things and going off and leading those wars. So again,
But we have modern crusades in the Christian church, and we try
getting Christ back in Christmas and getting those red cups back.
Yeah,
in
get them
Starbucks.
darn right. We have crusades, and you could even say we've got crusades like for even more politically charged things. We've got all these crusades,
Right.
But the reality is first off, sometimes the crusade isn't wrong at its heart. Like at its heart, like the intention is like, oh, we're trying to preserve something.
The idea is not wrong. It's how you went about it.
It's at the cost of what, right? And you and me, we always talk about this politically, like, I think we can go on record and both say, like, we're not for abortion.
No.
But I would argue, and maybe how we are going about achieving that is probably not the way Jesus would have gone about achieving it.
Right. Well, we would say that the ends justifies the means.
Right.
Right. It's like, well, yeah, I think then you're limiting God sometimes when you do that.
100%.
Like, gosh, I don't want to get into that.
I know the top part of
because
this.
it's a huge can of worms.
Sure.
But I think it does illustrate this point that, like, that is the problem with subjective morality, is that
Right.
the end does justify the means.
100%.
Stealing is no longer wrong if you did it for the right reason.
Right.
And the reason is subjective to the person who's doing it.
100%. Right.
So like you can justify anything morally if you don't have a set standard.
And that's why we have the word of God. Not only do we have the 10 commandments, but we have the word of God to test it, right? That's what Jesus even says, like test all the spirits, like
Right.
test everything against what I say, right?
Right.
So we don't get caught up into this.
And it's also why, with all of this that we were just discussing about not, having this moral set, but that we also have to look at it and study it and understand it. This is what he meant when he was saying, it's not enough to not commit adultery.
Right.
You have to avoid lust.
Right.
Right. Because this is the guiding force behind it.
Right.
You have to look deeper
Right.
to why we said that and what leads to this.
Right. He even says wealth is not a sin. greed is the sin.
Right.
And he names that time and time again. It's not that you have money. It's not that it's the fact that it's not enough for you. You know what I mean? Like,
but he also points out that it's hard not to become greedy when you have too much.
Exactly right.
So you put yourself in a bad situation.
Right. And that's what Jesus is looking. And that's where I think as Christians we have to understand, because I'm going to tell you, there are things in the Bible that I wish weren't in the Bible because I wish I could do them, or I wish I would, and I'm not, it sounds like I'm a terrible person, but I am. The flesh is a terrible thing, and like by the grace of God, the Spirit changed. And I did. I lived that life where I was like, screw this, I'm going to do what I want. But the Spirit, by God's grace, I know we just literally talked about that last episode, like has changed that in me. Doesn't mean, I always tell people I never gave up anything I didn't want to.
Right.
But there are things in the Bible that I'm like, oh God, but why is that? I mean, I think that no, I won't say it because that'll take another can of worms and a detour. But at the end of the day, I think I want everybody to understand that just because you don't agree with it, or just because you don't want to do it, isn't license for you to disregard it.
Right. Or just because you don't understand it. Yeah. So we've mentioned a couple examples already of like Nazi Germany.
Right.
We talked about slavery in America.
Sure.
Existing slavery right now. The Aztecs.
Sure.
These were examples of why secular or democratic morality doesn't work.
Right.
Right. Because it does leave a door open for evil.
Who's right? Russia or Ukraine?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? One thinks the other's wrong.
It leaves the door open for someone to call evil good and good evil.
Right.
Right. I think a couple other examples that we could give is, the Canaanites.
100%.
You and I would say abortion is definitely something here that we would talk about. Throughout most of human history, people have been awful.
Right. They crucified Jesus, just in case you guys are wondering.
Right, yeah.
You know what I mean? That's the Son of God.
Well, to be fair, he told him to repent. So Genesis 6:5. So this is something where the Bible talks about it.
Right.
Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of mankind was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. Mm-hmm. This is unchecked humanity.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Judges 21:25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Right.
We talked about that when we talked about Jephthah.
Right.
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 And like what a mistake he made.
Right.
Because he refused to look at God's law.
Sure.
It was in the law that he shouldn't do what he did.
Right.
But he did it anyway, and he did it in God's name.
Right.
Which was a mistake.
Right.
A very costly mistake. Right. So one of the things, though, that we've kind of hinted at as we've kind of talked about this, though, most morality that we adhere to nowadays is borrowed from Judeo-Christian standards.
Yeah.
Whether you want to admit it or not.
I'd say I would say it is. All of it is. I mean, when you break down anything that's truly ethical and moral.
Right.
Like that truly hits at the heart of, and that's biblical, right?
Right.
God only does good stuff.
Well, take the Ten Commandments.
Right. Sure.
Is murder wrong? Most people would say yes.
Yes.
Is stealing wrong? Again, most people would say, it's
well, free me from a selfish. I don't want to die, so yeah.
Yeah.
Murder's
I don't
wrong.
want somebody to take my stuff.
Right.
Covetousness is wrong.
Right.
Adultery, we're getting a little looser on that.
Right.
But we acknowledge that it hurts people.
Right.
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 Now we get to America and we say, as we become more secular, I don't necessarily disagree with the Ten Commandments, but it shouldn't be in our courtroom.
Right.
Right. Okay.
So
why not?
Where's the law come from?
Right. So it comes from the laws that are on the books.
Right.
And so okay, well, let's put America's law up there then. It will say, do not murder, right. Do not steal.
Right. Isn't that crazy that America's law kind of has the same commandments?
Right. Yeah. Now, it doesn't say necessarily don't commit adultery, but it does say if you do commit adultery, you're probably going to get less than the divorce.
Well, let's just start right. Well, yeah. Right? But here's the interesting thing about the commandments. The first 5 are all about God and our relationship with God.
Yeah.
The last 5 are all about our relationship with each other.
Right.
Every issue of morality between each other is all I mean, everything, whether you're secular or not, is all rooted in our relationship with God, right? Like God shows us in his word why we don't do these things to each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
So it's interesting too. I feel like people then, that's why they dismiss it, is because it has to do with God.
100%.
And it suggests that God has to be involved. And secular moralists want to say, I don't need God to be good.
Right.
But they've never proven that they can.
And you notice they're always the first ones to point out how bad God is. Like, oh, well, see, God, clearly he allows this evil. The world's bad.
Right.
But you just said...
But that's if there is bad, then God is.
That's what exactly right.
Then
right.
God exists.
They're quickly to say he's bad, but they're not quick to say he's good.
Right. You say he's bad, but see, then this is the thing though, is you say he's bad based on whose standard too.
Right.
Right. On your standard or his standard.
Right.
And like if he is God, then his standard is the one that matters.
Right.
Right. But if he doesn't exist, then it doesn't matter what he did.
Right. But we only focus on the things that are bad, and then we say that's what he did.
Right.
Or why didn't he?
Right. But that's the thing, is like you and I have talked about this before. We look at the Canaanites, and he's kind of darned if he does, darned if he doesn't there.
Right.
You know, well, why didn't God take care of all the evil that the Canaanites were doing? Oh, he did. He brought the people of Israel in and told them to destroy the Canaanites.
Right.
How could God justify destroying an entire people?
Right.
You mean the people who have been sacrificing their children for 450 years?
Right. And who also disobeyed the commands of God long ago.
Right. And this is where people miss this is, okay, so what you just said right there, this is where a secularist is going to take this and be upset. Disobeying a deity is evil?
It's a consequence.
Okay. But is it evil? In our sense, yes.
Yeah.
Disobeying God is evil, and they can't wrap their heads around that.
Right.
The reason is because they won't admit or accept that God is good, and therefore every commandment he gives
is good.
Right. And here's the thing. We look at his commandments, and when it doesn't align with what we think is good, we want to say there's a problem with God.
100%.
But the truth is there's a problem with us because we don't understand his commandment.
Right.
And we have to figure out, sometimes we have to fake it till we make it.
Sure.
And go with his commandments until we get it. And
we have to trust.
Revelation. We have to trust God.
Right.
But that's the thing, is God is not actively asking us to harm people.
Since I stopped drinking and like getting drunk, like I used to like just get hammered, man, my life is so much better.
Yeah.
I think any alcoholic, we have tons of AA programs here, and I think if you ask any one of them, they would say my life has gotten exponentially better since I stopped doing that.
Yeah.
When you ask why, and you really break down why, like God's warning you. That's why he's not trying to be this restrictive, terrible God that's like, you can't have any fun. Yeah. Like, no, he's telling you, if it's the same thing, lust. Like, if you look lustfully, I'm warning you. It leads to these. And so I think that, like you said, like the idea that God is good and evil is evil, and God is not evil, like that's a hard concept for people to wrap their minds around, because they're not ready to admit that what they're personally doing is evil.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. All right. So let's kick back on Christianity for a minute.
Let's kick on them.
Okay. So Christians don't even adhere to all the rules in the Bible.
Hypocrites.
Bunch of hypocrites. Show's over.
That's right.
Go home.
That's right. Go home. Boo.
But this is something we hear all the time.
100%.
Like, okay, so if God is good and his law is good, why don't you adhere to his law? And then what they'll do is they'll pull out Leviticus.
Right.
And they'll start reading to you, and they're like, why do you pick and choose some of these things from Leviticus and let other things go?
Right.
Let me give you a couple of examples. Mixing of crops. Okay.
Yep.
Mixing of cloth, like not wearing.
Yeah, you and me, we're struggling, bro. We're sinning right now,
buddy. Yeah. You can't shave the sides of your beard. I'm doing okay with that.
I'm not, man. I got it. Yeah. I'm headed. I'm on a highway to hell right now.
How about eating shellfish?
Oh well, I'm okay with that one. I don't like shellfish.
Look, you're gonna sit there and say that somebody can't be gay,
right, because
of a law in the Bible,
right?
But you're going to ignore this,
right?
So your morality is subjective because you're picking and choosing. What do you say?
All right. Yeah, you're right, man. I guess I'll stop believing.
Yeah, that's right.
No,
You've undone us.
I think here's where, again, the word of God becomes so important. Go look at someone like Jesus.
Right.
Because, I mean, he clearly disobeys some of those laws.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. Vadi Bakum does a really good job of responding to this, and you can catch him on YouTube. He's a minister, and he's been involved in a lot of things, but he breaks this down so well. And he talks about this. He says, I can point to you in the Bible how I justify every action I take or don't take.
100%.
Says, but you can't.
Right.
Right. So you're also picking and choosing now which ones you'll follow. But I can tell you why I'm picking and choosing, and you can't tell me why you're picking and choosing.
100%.
Right. And so let's break down a few of these things. And I'd love to go into this with more depth somewhere down the road. But the first thing that's first is when we talk about Old Testament law,
Right.
The law that we've said time and time again that we are no longer under,
Right.
we are under grace,
Right.
has three components: moral law, civil law, and ceremonial law. Okay, so moral law reflects what is right and just. It identifies acceptable behaviors. The example for this is the Ten Commandments. These are timeless laws, right?
Right.
This is morality.
Right.
So this is what we've been talking about today, is this will always be right and this will always be wrong.
Right.
Right. The next thing is civil law. So civil and criminal laws for the nation of Israel were recorded in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, all of those, right?
Right.
Numbers. Not every governed law is about morality.
Right.
Some of it is about societal needs and practicalities. So penal laws, sentencing for theft and murder. So we know that the moral law says that murder is wrong. It's the civil law that tells us what the cost for that should be, right?
Right.
Health laws, sanitary codes, inheritance laws. There is no imperatives for the church or any nation to adopt the ones that the people of Israel used.
Right.
Because too much is different societally. Right. What they did may not work for us.
Right.
Right? But these were the things that God prescribed to them for that time.
Right.
Okay, so that was civil law. Ceremonial law is the other one.
Right.
First of all, if you're not believing in God, then none of these matter.
Right. Yeah.
But if you do believe in God, the ceremonial law governed how people of Israel approached and worshiped God. They had sacrificial systems, religious feasts, ceremonial purity, health, and dietary laws. And these laws, the primary purpose for these laws were to set them apart from how other nations practice worship.
Right.
Right. And a lot of these laws are now outdated and unnecessary as Jesus has fulfilled that law.
Right.
So let me give you an example of that. John 4:19-24, Jesus meets the woman at the well.
Right.
The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and yet you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where you must worship." So this was ceremonial law.
Right.
Jesus said to her, "Believe me, woman, that a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, because salvation is from the Jews. But a time is coming, and even now has arrived, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." So here's again an example of Jesus fulfilling these laws
100%.
and showing her that some of these laws are intended to change.
Well, Jesus flat out says it. Like I think it's with someone caught in, he's questioned on the question of divorce. I got to find the verse. I was just thinking about it, but he's questioned on the topic of divorce, and he straight out calls it. He says, like, you made that law because you couldn't follow God's law. Like this was another law because you couldn't get the right one. And I think that's what's important. Like, this is what's so funny. Like, the Jews have 18 commands they have to follow, like, of the law. What's really interesting is that God didn't send Moses down with 618 commands.
Right.
With laws. He gave 10.
Right.
And so what happened was we couldn't meet those 10, so we made 15. And then we made 20. And then, and so what Jesus is even doing with the woman at the well is saying, look, these laws were created because you couldn't keep the most simplistic laws.
Yes.
And there's a time coming, when those simplistic laws will be unnecessary because I will be sufficient
Right.
in everything you need.
Right. And he also,
Spirit and truth.
He also makes this comment about how salvation comes through the Jews, but then he talks about how it is going out. And this again was kind of ending this concept of God's people,
right,
and making it more globally God's people.
Right.
We see this again in Acts when Peter sees the vision of the things brought down from heaven, and he says, "I cannot eat of these things." He says,
right,
"Do not call unclean what I have called clean."
Right.
So again, you can point to these things and see where the law was fulfilled and where it continued.
Well, so here's one that I always, I don't think it's on. I was just looking at the list. I don't think it's on here, but I always see people are always ask me about this one, which is like sexual laws.
Yeah.
Because they're like, well, the idea that like Jesus never talked about homosexuality. That's something I've heard. Or Jesus never really talked about like, Another one. Here's one. And this is legalistic. I will say it is legalistic because I do think there's a truth. There is nothing written in the Bible, at least not that I've ever really seen, explicitly saying don't live together before marriage. But this is kind of the lust thing, right?
Yes.
Like don't. Why would you open that door?
Why would you do that?
Why would you do that? And so I always tell people, are you sinning? I don't know. You got to tell me some more information that I don't want to know. I was like, but I would ask you, why do you think is that wise? And that's what something like Paul and Jesus would even say. But here's what I always say when people talk about like sexual stuff like that. Jesus with the woman caught in adultery is a prime example of Jesus upholding a moral law of some sort,
yes,
right? Because we talked about this last session. Like he says, go and sin no more. So he says what she did was wrong. Now, granted, he gives grace. That's where our God is awesome. But he still says it's wrong.
Yeah.
And don't do that. And so he is still upholding a law.
Yeah.
A morality.
To your point, he affirms the moral law that adultery was wrong.
Exactly right.
Where he refutes them, because all these things they did to him were traps.
Right.
Was they wanted him to unjustly enact the civil law.
Exactly right.
Which was the stoning.
To kill her, yes.
Right? And the problem with that, and as he points out, a lot of you needed to have been stoned.
Right. Everybody needs to get killed,
If I do this, but I don't do that, then you have caught me.
Right.
Right. So there's some parts in that where you look at that. And someday we're going to do a podcast about all the things Jesus never said.
That's awesome. Yeah.
But so we'll get into that.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. Jesus upheld a moral law while showing where other things fell apart. There was a
ceremonial law. Jesus doesn't. He picks grain on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
So he's clearly showing us there are some, and he doesn't. He encourages his disciples to do it.
Yeah.
Even they're like, Jesus, we can't do this. And he's like,
when they get called out on it, he explains, you don't understand the heart of the law because you don't understand the lawgiver.
Right. You don't understand the moral.
Yeah.
Like the moral, and I think that's a funny thing is we talk the moral of the story. Like that's what it's talking about. What is at the heart, right?
That's so much of why he spoke in parables.
Right.
I had a teacher in college who talked about going from the old covenant to the new covenant and what we were under. He said, you think of it as the cross being here and then everything hits that cross and only some of those things come out on the other side. And here's the thing. All of the writings in the New Testament show us that the early church navigated the transition from old to new covenant.
For sure.
And there are a number of things that kind of occur. So like, as we saw here, Jesus prophesied in John 4 that the way we worship was going to change and would no longer be ruled by ceremonial law.
Right.
And then both Jesus and the apostles affirmed the moral law and commanded that we should leave immorality behind.
Right.
Things like hate and murder, covetousness and theft.
Right.
But also sexual immorality.
Right.
Right. And so here's where when people try to say, you pick and choose what you want. It's like, we didn't. God picked and chose what we wanted.
Right.
And what he wanted us to keep was what is the moral law.
Right.
And you're trying to take something that's in the moral law and put it in the civil law or in the ceremonial law.
That's why Jesus says, I came to fulfill it. What he's saying is, I am fulfilling all the things that you couldn't do, right? Because that's the civil law.
Yeah.
All the things you couldn't do, I am fulfilling. That doesn't change God's commandments.
Exactly.
it fulfills the fact that I can wear jeans and I can wear cotton. You know, like that's what he's saying. Those are the civil moral. Those aren't moral laws. Those are civil laws that you had to create because you couldn't follow certain things in the moral law, and then it becomes a ceremonial law because heaven forbid you actually just worship God as God. You know, and so Jesus says, I am the fulfillment of that, and then he teaches us to live into that.
Yeah,
you know, and I think it's funny too because I will hear a lot of people who don't believe, because Jesus is a hard guy to logically reason away, historically speaking. Because I mean, you can't. I mean, he's such a hard figure to. I mean, everybody talks about him, you know, and we're still talking about him. And so I will hear people in the same breath who say God isn't real, say that Jesus was a good guy.
How do you come to that conclusion?
Right. On what ground?
Right. There's so much. Okay. So first of all, again, when you got rid of God,
right,
you got rid of the concept of good and evil,
right,
other than what was subjective. And here's the truth. If you've gotten rid of God's rule of what is good and evil,
right,
and then you say that Jesus was good, but if you look at what Jesus said, Jesus said, I am God.
That's why he says there's no one good. You call me good teacher.
Right, but there's no one good but God.
But yeah,
you know, so there is the problem with that is people who say that are just trying to appease Christians,
sure,
while saying that they don't believe in Christianity.
Right.
But the truth is this: if you don't believe that Jesus is who he said he is a nut job.
Right. Right.
Okay. He's one or the other. He is the Messiah or he is nothing.
That's so true. Yeah. But because here's the thing. Even my atheist friends that still struggle to believe will all admit that you can't get mad at Jesus. He was a good guy. He loved everybody. I mean, I got a young guy that I've been talking to for a while. And like I'm laughing right now, but he still kind of sees Jesus in that Herculean sense, like like he's
demigod.
The demigod kind of idea. But it's funny because he really likes Jesus in the aspect of like Jesus is a cool dude. Like I mean, like he's like take it to the man, like I mean, like he's. But what you just said is so true. If you take Jesus, like he loved people, blessed are the poor, like he is like the best liberal you ever met in your whole life. And then you take the Messiah out of him and you're like, this dude's a nut job.
But that's the thing. He was a terrible liberal. And I'm going
to,
especially in a theological sense.
Sure.
Because when you look at what he did, okay, again, like, the liberal wants to say, oh, well, Jesus spent time with the sinners. That's who he hung out with.
Right.
He hung out with the sinners.
Yeah.
Like he called them ill. Right. He said they were ill and in need of a doctor.
He to their face, by the way. They were all sitting there when he said that.
They were sitting right there. They were sitting right there with him. Do you think he was sitting there saying, hey, that's cool what you're doing over there, so-and-so?
Yeah.
I love that thing that you're doing. He was standing there saying, you need to stop doing what you're doing. Look at the woman at the well. When he meets her,
you're right. You're with one that is not your husband. You've had 4 husbands.
And you've had 4 before.
Yeah.
So like Jesus called people out for their sin.
100%.
All the time. And okay, Jesus took care of the poor.
Right.
Okay. When they got mad at Jesus and like, look, I get this. He was rebutting them because they were coming from the wrong place.
Sure.
But like this woman broke this jar of perfume and anointed his feet. And
100%.
they're like, Jesus, you could have sold that and given that money to the poor.
Right.
And his response was, you'll always have the poor, but you'll only have me today.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Tell me how that meshes with your sense of giving of alms.
Right.
Now, what gets pointed out, I think this is in John, this gets pointed out, that the person who was complaining was Judas.
Right.
And the reason that Judas was complaining wasn't because that money wasn't getting to the poor. It was because it wasn't getting to his pocket because he managed the money and he stole from it.
He wanted the money. Right.
And here's the thing I learned from that. Every person that tells you that you're not doing enough is telling you that out of a selfish ambition.
100%.
100% of the time. And because their morality isn't that giving is good. Their morality is what I need is what is
better. Well, most certainly. I get that as a pastor all the time, right? It's like you said, it's funny. The ones who critique are rarely the ones who are serving.
Yeah.
And if they are serving, they're serving for the wrong reason.
Absolutely.
But this goes to that idea of this idea of the moral law and why the moral argument is so powerful. Because as you strip away every layer of the onion, we have an answer for every reason why we do everything.
We do. We can make an intellectual. We can have an intellectual conversation about how we land where we land on our morality.
Well,
the problem is when you do that with somebody who does it subjectively,
right?
They can't.
And that's where we have to. And I think that this is, I know we're kind of wrapping up, but this is where one thing I do want to say before we go is I think one thing that's important for us to hear is this is where we have a duty and a responsibility to love those people like Jesus, because I think a lot of times when we get into arguments, moral arguments, things like that, and these discussions and debates, we have a tendency to belittle, to let emotion, and we're not wrong, but we're also not right. You know what I mean? Like how we're doing it is not right. And so I want to really encourage people. Our job isn't to convince them.
Yeah.
It's to lovingly show them.
Right.
You're
right. Well, when you fight fire with fire, you burn everything down.
Right.
And our job is not to burn this place down.
Right.
Our job is to create restoration between man and God.
100%.
And I say not create restoration. Jesus reconciles us with God.
Right, to show that.
Our job is to get people to Jesus so they can be reconciled, not to burn them down.
Right.
We are not God's justice or vengeance, as we talked about. We are not the Boondock Saints.
No, we are not the Boondock Saints. We are not. That's not right.
Right.
Yeah.
But we are his people and we are his ambassadors.
Right.
Intended to point people to Christ. And one of the things that points people to Christ, one of the things that points people to God is this concept that morality comes from somewhere.
Has to.
And when you really objectively do this, and I know some of this is going to be opinion or perceived as opinion.
Sure.
But when you objectively break it down, the morality of the Bible and the morality of God is good.
I don't believe in Jesus because I like Jesus. I believe in Jesus because he's true.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things I'll say, whether it's the moral argument or a scientific argument, because you can make a scientific, I can't even say the word scientific argument about God, is science will say this. One of the natural tenets is it's better to have a reason for something than no reason whatsoever. Right. That is the moral argument, that God is our reason. And the funny thing is it's not a God of, I want people to understand this too, because when we talk about the moral argument, sometimes they're like, well, that's just God to the gaps, right? You're just using God's name to fill in the gap that I can't answer. Well, yeah, but I'm also using God's name because here it is in his word.
Right. Well,
you know what I mean?
There's only a gap because you attempted to erase God.
Right.
He was there. There was no gap.
Right.
He was there, and then you tried to remove him
right.
from there. From the earliest time, I know C.S. Lewis said this, like from the beginning of time, man has believed in the spirits and in the supernatural.
Right.
It's always been a part of it's only been more recently that we've tried to remove it from the equation.
Right.
And said that
it's all but it's all for subjective gain, right?
It's all for subjective gain because it permits me to have a subjective morality that allows me to do what I want and what I please to my own ends.
What benefit do I have? Well, I think that's the question the Christian can ask is what benefit do I have for believing this?
Eternal salvation.
Right. Yeah. But you don't believe in that. So what benefit do I have? Why?
Well, the non-believer would say this. You don't benefit from it.
Right.
You're being deceived, with the carrot on a stick of a heaven.
Right.
Right. So you're following God's arbitrary laws.
It's weird
like
though,
don't kill and don't steal.
Because statistically speaking, like Christians tend to be happier. Christians tend to have more.
Christians also tend to have spread more enlightenment around the world, and people don't want to look at the truth.
Right.
They want to have this false reality that allows them to be without God.
Right.
They want to be sufficient, and they're not. And that's the thing. Like we see this over and over again with arguments like this. The best case for morality is that there is a moral arbiter.
Right.
The best case for creation is that there is an intelligent designer.
Right.
Right. We see this over and over again, and then you say, prove it. It is evident.
Right.
It is evident. You have ignored what is in front of your face.
100%.
just like many people have ignored the brilliance that are these drums.
We're gonna have a rhythmic argument for the holiness of drums. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I know that's an abrupt end. Look, there's so much more we could go here. There's so many more places we could go, and I feel like.
And we had 13 different podcasts come up in the midst of this that we'll probably go to at some point.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. There's a lot there. So here's the thing: go out and get a good book. Go out and read the Word. Read the Scripture. A great book I would recommend is God a Moral Monster? Go read that one, and that might help you with wrestle with some of these things.
Yes.
But otherwise, be blessed and enjoy these drums.
Yeah.
That I have to play.
That are objectively good.
Objectively good.